In the autumn of 1943, along the roads and railway platforms of Bengal, thousands waited for food that did not come. In villages emptied by hunger, families sold land, tools, and heirlooms for a few handfuls of rice. In the crowded streets of Calcutta, relief kitchens struggled as the numbers swelled beyond control. By the time the crisis receded, an estimated 3 million people had died. The famine unfolded not in a remote colony beyond the reach of power, but within the British Empire at the height of the Second World War, under a government that commanded global resources yet failed to prevent catastrophe in one of its most populous provinces. Bengal in the early 20th century was one of the most densely populated regions in the world. Its economy depended heavily on rice cultivation, supplemented by jute production for export. Millions of small tenant farmers cultivated fragmented plots under complex landholding systems shaped by colonial revenue policies dating back to the permanent settlement of 1793. Chronic rural poverty, indebtedness, and limited access to credit meant that many households lived close to subsistence even in ordinary years. Agricultural productivity had improved only modestly despite population growth. Food security in Bengal relied on stable harvests, functioning transport networks, and the ability to import rice from neighboring provinces and from Burma. The outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 transformed the economic and political environment. India became a central base for Allied operations in Asia. Wartime demand stimulated certain industries but also triggered inflation. Military procurement, infrastructure construction, and the presence of Allied forces increased pressure on food supplies. At the same time, political tensions between Indian leaders and the British colonial administration intensified. The Quit India movement of 1942, launched by the Indian National Congress, was met with mass arrests and repression. Governance in Bengal became increasingly strained as wartime priorities overshadowed civilian administration. A decisive blow came in early 1942 when Japanese forces captured Burma. Burma had been a major supplier of rice to India, including Bengal. The loss of Burmese imports removed a significant buffer in the regional food balance. That same year, the British authorities, fearing a Japanese invasion of eastern India, implemented a series of denial policies. Boats in coastal districts were confiscated or destroyed to prevent their use by a potential invading army. Stocks of rice in certain areas were removed or requisitioned. These measures disrupted local trade networks and transport systems that rural communities depended upon for moving grain from surplus to deficit areas. In October 1942, a severe cyclone struck parts of coastal Bengal, particularly the district of Midnapore. The storm destroyed standing crops, flooded fields with saline water, and damaged infrastructure. In the aftermath, a fungal disease known as brown spot affected rice crops in some regions, further reducing yields. While estimates vary, the combined effect of natural disaster and crop disease contributed to a substantial shortfall in local production. However, historians continue to debate the precise magnitude of the deficit and the extent to which it alone can explain the scale of mortality that followed. As 1942 turned to 1943, prices of rice began to rise sharply. Wartime inflation had already eroded purchasing power, especially for landless laborers, fishermen, and artisans who depended on daily wages. Grain merchants, anticipating shortages and further price increases, engaged in hoarding and speculative trade. The colonial government was slow to impose effective price controls or to organize large-scale imports. The administrative machinery in Bengal proved fragmented, divided between provincial authorities and the central government of India in New Delhi, which itself operated under the strategic imperatives of the global war. By the first half of 1943, rice prices in Bengal had multiplied several times over pre-war levels. For wealthier households, food remained available at a cost. For the rural poor, access collapsed. Many families sold livestock, land rights, cooking utensils, and clothing to purchase grain. When assets were exhausted, migration began. Tens of thousands traveled to urban centers, particularly Calcutta, hoping to find work or relief. The city, already swollen by wartime activity and refugees from Japanese-occupied territories, struggled to cope with the influx. Reports from the countryside described villages where agricultural laborers could no longer secure employment because landowners themselves faced uncertainty. In some districts, entire communities lost their means of subsistence within months. malnutrition weakened resistance to disease, and epidemics of malaria, cholera, and dysentery spread through vulnerable populations. Mortality rose sharply in mid-1943 and reached its peak between July and October. While exact figures remain contested, scholarly estimates generally range between 2 and 3 million deaths, with 3 million frequently cited in contemporary and later assessments. The response of the British government has been the subject of sustained historical scrutiny. In London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill's war cabinet prioritized shipping for military operations and the defense of the empire. Requests from India for grain imports competed with demands from other theaters of war. Shipping shortages were real and severe, exacerbated by submarine warfare in the Atlantic and the need to supply Allied forces in Europe and North Africa. Nonetheless, critics argue that imperial priorities and racial attitudes shaped decisions that delayed or limited relief. Churchill's recorded remarks during the crisis have drawn particular criticism for their apparent indifference to Indian suffering, though historians caution that policy decisions involved multiple actors and constraints. Within India, the Government of India eventually arranged for increased imports of grain from other provinces and from abroad, including shipments from Australia. Relief measures expanded in late 1943 and early 1944. Public works programs, gratuitous relief for the destitute, and feeding centers were established. However, by the time these interventions reached full scale, the worst mortality had already occurred. Administrative failures, delays in acknowledging the severity of the crisis, and inadequate coordination between provincial and central authorities contributed to the slow response. The famine also exposed structural weaknesses in the colonial economy. Bengal's reliance on market mechanisms to distribute food proved disastrous when purchasing power collapsed among large segments of the population. Economist Amartya Sen, in later analysis, argued that the famine was less a result of absolute food shortage and more a failure of entitlements, meaning the ability of individuals to command food through legal means such as wages, trade, or production. This interpretation shifted attention from aggregate supply to the distributional consequences of inflation and wartime policies. While scholars continue to debate the balance between production decline and market failure, there is broad agreement that administrative and economic systems did not protect the most vulnerable. The social impact was profound. Rural society in Bengal underwent lasting disruption. Many smallholders lost land through distress sales. Traditional patron-client relationships eroded under the strain of scarcity. Urban centers witnessed unprecedented numbers of destitute migrants. The crisis intensified communal tensions in some areas, though the famine itself was not primarily organized along religious lines. It also reshaped political consciousness. Indian leaders across the political spectrum cited the famine as evidence of the moral and administrative bankruptcy of colonial rule. In 1944, the British government established the Famine Inquiry Commission to investigate the causes and administration of relief. The Commission's report, published in 1945, acknowledged serious shortcomings in response and highlighted the role of inflation, transport disruption, and policy failures. It recommended reforms in food policy and greater state responsibility for preventing future famines. Yet the findings did not immediately resolve debates over accountability. For many Indians, the famine reinforced demands for self-government and economic sovereignty. Internationally, the Bengal famine unfolded alongside other wartime tragedies, often overshadowed by events in Europe and the Pacific. Global media coverage was limited and sometimes delayed by wartime censorship. Photographs that did circulate shocked observers but did not alter the strategic priorities of Allied governments. The episode revealed the vulnerabilities of colonial territories integrated into global war economies without adequate safeguards for civilian welfare. By 1944, improved harvests and increased imports gradually stabilized the situation. Mortality declined, though the long-term effects on health persisted. Children who survived severe malnutrition faced lasting physical consequences. Economic recovery was uneven, and many households remained indebted. The famine left demographic scars visible in census data and in the collective memory of Bengal. When India gained independence in 1947, the memory of the famine informed early policy debates in the new nation. Food security became a central concern. Post-independence governments invested in agricultural research, irrigation, and later in the Green Revolution to reduce dependence on imports and mitigate the risk of mass starvation. Public distribution systems and buffer stock policies were designed in part as lessons drawn from 1943. Although India has faced food shortages since independence, it has not experienced a famine on the scale of Bengal in 1943, a fact often attributed to democratic accountability, improved transport, and proactive state intervention. The Bengal famine also influenced global thinking on development and humanitarian response. It contributed to emerging post-war conversations about human rights, economic planning, and the responsibilities of governments toward their populations. Scholars continue to analyze the interplay of war, empire, market forces, and environmental shocks that converged in 1943. The famine stands as a case study in how political and economic systems can amplify the effects of natural disasters. Today, estimates of 3 million dead serve as a stark measure of the catastrophe scale. Yet numbers alone cannot convey the cumulative impact on families, communities, and institutions. The famine disrupted a generation, altered landholding patterns, and intensified the momentum toward the end of British rule in India. It remains one of the most significant humanitarian disasters of the 20th century within the British Empire. In 1943, as the world's great powers mobilized armies and fleets across continents, millions in Bengal faced a different battle, shaped by crop failure, wartime policy, inflation, and administrative delay. The famine did not result from a single decision or a single event. It emerged from the intersection of global conflict and local vulnerability, of environmental shock and economic structure. Its legacy endures in historical debate and in the enduring imperative to ensure that food security is treated not as a peripheral concern but as a central responsibility of governance.